The heavy silence of a Tuesday night is a peculiar thing, especially when you live in a house that seems to breathe with the settling of old wood and the distant hum of a dying refrigerator. I was sitting in my living room, the only light coming from the pale blue glow of my laptop screen, when the first sound broke the stillness of the neighborhood. It wasn't a loud noise, but in the vacuum of a 2 a.m. silence, it sounded like a gunshot echoing through the hallway. Someone was standing on my porch, and they weren't just passing by. They were waiting. Most people would think it was a neighbor or a friend in trouble, but I knew everyone on this cul-de-sac, and nobody knocks at 2 in the morning unless they are bringing news that will change your life forever. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. Then, it came again. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the mahogany door. Knock, knock, knock. I stood up slowly, making sure my feet didn't scuff against the hardwood floor, and crept toward the front hallway. The air in the house felt suddenly colder, as if the person outside had brought the winter chill with them and pressed it against the glass. I reached the door and looked through the tiny fisheye of the peephole, my breath catching in my throat. Standing there was a man dressed in a bright neon courier's vest, holding a rectangular cardboard box tucked under his arm. He looked professional enough, but something was deeply wrong with the picture. His face was cast in shadow by the brim of a dark baseball cap, and he wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at the small decorative ceramic owl my mother had given me, which sat on the porch bench. He was staring at it with an intensity that made my skin crawl, his head tilted at an angle that didn't seem natural for someone just trying to do their job. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and brittle in the empty foyer. The man didn't jump or act surprised that I was awake. He simply turned his head toward the door, though the brim of his hat still obscured his eyes. "Delivery for Sarah Miller," he said, his voice a low, sandpaper rasp that sounded like it hadn't been used in years. "I need a signature for the overnight package, or I can't leave it on the step." A cold drop of sweat rolled down the back of my neck. My name is Sarah Miller, but I hadn't ordered anything, and more importantly, I had moved into this house only 3 weeks ago. I hadn't updated my address on any of my shopping accounts yet, and even my own father still sent mail to my old apartment across the city. How did this man know my name? And how did he know I was behind this door at this exact hour? "I'm not opening the door," I said, trying to sound firmer than I felt. "Leave it on the porch and walk away, or I'm calling the police." "It's a restricted delivery, Sarah," he replied, using my first name with a terrifying level of familiarity. The sender was very specific about the handoff. "It's from the apartment on Oak Street, the one with the broken window latch." My blood turned to ice in my veins. My old apartment on Oak Street had a broken window latch that I had complained about for months. It was a detail only I and my former landlord knew, or someone who had been watching me from the shadows of the alleyway behind the building. I backed away from the door, my mind racing through 1,000 terrifying possibilities. Was he a stalker who had followed me here? How long had he been sitting in the dark, watching the lights in my windows go on and off, learning the rhythm of my life? I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife I could find, my hands shaking so violently that the blade rattled against the granite countertop. I needed to check the security cameras, the ones I had installed just last week but hadn't fully configured yet. I pulled up the app on my phone, my thumb fumbling over the screen. The feed for the front porch was grainy and dark, but I could see him. He wasn't walking away. In fact, he had put the box down. As I watched the screen, the man reached into his neon vest and pulled out a long, thin piece of metal. He wasn't a courier. He was a locksmith or someone with the skills of one. He leaned into the door, and I heard the faint, metallic tink of a pick entering the deadbolt. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't waiting for me to open the door. He was just confirming that I was home before he started his real work. He wanted me to be there when he got inside. "I'm calling 911, I screamed, running back to the hallway. "I have a gun and I will use it." I didn't have a gun, but I hoped the lie would buy me time. The picking sound stopped for a second. Silence returned to the porch, heavier than before. I thought for a moment that he might have been scared off, but then I heard a low, chilling chuckle from the other side of the wood. It was a sound of pure, calculated malice. "The police are 6 minutes away at best, Sarah," he whispered through the door crack. "And I only need 2. I realized then that I couldn't stay in the hallway. If he got through that door, I was trapped in a narrow space with nowhere to run. I bolted for the stairs, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm against my chest. I needed to get to the upstairs bathroom, the only room in the house with a solid core door and a heavy manual bolt. As I scrambled up the steps, I heard the sound I had been dreading, the heavy thud of the front door swinging open and hitting the baseboard. He was inside. I slammed the bathroom door shut and threw the bolt just as I heard his heavy footsteps hitting the first step of the staircase. He wasn't rushing. He was walking with a slow, rhythmic pace, like a predator who knew the prey had nowhere left to go. I sat on the floor, pressing my back against the tub, clutching my phone with white-knuckled intensity. The 911 operator was on the line, her voice a calm contrast to the chaos in my head. "Help is on the way, Sarah. Stay on the line with me. Hide where you can. He's in the house," I whispered into the phone, tears finally breaking through and blurring my vision. "He's coming up the stairs." The footsteps reached the landing. They paused. I could imagine him standing there, looking at the closed doors, sensing my fear through the drywall. Then, the footsteps started again, moving toward the bathroom. He stopped right outside. I could hear his breathing, heavy, ragged, and excited. "Knock, knock, knock." He was knocking on the bathroom door now. "You forgot your package, Sarah," he said, his voice right next to my ear, separated only by an inch of wood. "Don't you want to see what's inside?" The door handle began to jiggle, slowly at first, then with violent, aggressive jerks. The wood groaned under the pressure, and I saw the frame begin to splinter near the bolt. I knew the door wouldn't hold for long. I looked around the small room, desperate for an escape. There was a small frosted window above the toilet, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It led out onto the kitchen roof, a steep slope that dropped off into the backyard. I didn't think, I acted. I stood on the toilet and shoved the window open, the cold night air rushing in like a hand grabbing my face. I pushed my phone into my pocket and scrambled through the opening, my coat catching on the latch for a heart-stopping second. Behind me, I heard a loud crack as the bathroom door finally gave way. I tumbled onto the shingles, the rough surface scraping my palms as I slid toward the edge. I looked back and saw a hand, pale and gloved, reaching through the window, grasping at the air where I had been standing just seconds before. I didn't wait to see his face. I slid down the roof and dropped into the bushes below, the impact jarring my teeth and sending a jolt of pain through my ankles. I didn't stop running until I reached the street, where the distant glow of blue and red lights was finally cutting through the darkness. 2 police cruisers tore around the corner, their sirens wailing a beautiful, chaotic symphony. I collapsed onto the pavement, waving my arms and screaming for help. The police searched the house, but the man was gone. They found the neon vest discarded in the hallway and the cardboard box sitting in the middle of my bed. When the bomb squad arrived to check the package, they found it wasn't an explosive. Inside the box was a single framed photograph of me. It was a photo of me sleeping in my bed, taken from the very window I had just climbed out of. The date on the back of the photo was from the night before. I moved out the next day and never went back. I live in a high-rise now with 24-hour security and 3 different locks on my door. But every night, when the clock strikes 2 a.m. and the world goes quiet, I find myself staring at the door, waiting for the sound of a delivery man who has no package to deliver. I survived that night, but the silence has never felt safe again. The neighborhood had been plunged into a thick, velvety darkness for nearly 3 hours after a transformer blew out at the edge of the woods, leaving every house on the street looking like a hollowed-out shell. I was sitting in my kitchen, the pale flame of a single scented candle casting long, flickering shadows against the cabinets, when I heard the heavy crunch of gravel in my driveway. In a blackout, every sound is magnified, and the slow, deliberate slamming of a van door felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I peered through the blinds, but the moon was hidden behind a thick layer of storm clouds, making it impossible to see anything beyond a faint, neon yellow reflection moving toward my front porch. Then, the sound that always makes the hair on my neck stand up began. Knock! 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 I didn't answer at first, hoping that whoever it was would realize the house was dark and move on to the next one. But the person outside didn't leave. Instead, I heard the heavy metallic jingle of a tool belt and the sound of someone adjusting a heavy piece of equipment on the wooden planks of the porch. I crept toward the door, my bare feet silent on the linoleum, and looked through the peephole. Standing there was a man wearing a bright high-visibility vest over a thick canvas jacket, a hard hat pulled low over his forehead, and a heavy industrial toolbox resting at his feet. "Gas company, ma'am," he called out, his voice muffled by the thick wood of the door but carrying a tone of practiced, professional urgency. "We're doing a door-to-door safety check because of the surge that took out the transformer. There's a reported leak 2 houses down, and we need to check the pilot lights in the basement to make sure nobody's house fills with vapor while the power is out." It sounded perfectly logical, and in the middle of a confusing blackout, most people would have turned the deadbolt without a second thought. But as I leaned in closer to the peephole, my heart skipped a beat. The man was dressed exactly like a utility worker, but as he reached up to adjust his hard hat, the sleeve of his jacket pulled back. Underneath the dirty canvas of his work clothes, he was wearing an expensive, shimmering silver watch, the kind that costs more than a year's worth of utility bills. And then I looked down at his feet. He wasn't wearing steel-toed work boots. He was wearing polished, black leather dress shoes that were now caked in the mud from my front yard. "I didn't smell any gas," I said, my voice shaking as I tried to sound as if I were just a confused homeowner. "And I thought the gas company usually sends a notification or has a marked truck. I don't see any flashing lights in the street. The main trucks are at the station. We're just the scouts on foot to save time, ma'am," he replied instantly, his voice never losing that calm, authoritative edge. "But the leak is significant. If I don't check your basement, I'll have to report this address to the fire department and they'll have to break your door down to ensure the block is safe. It's better if you just let me in for 2 minutes so I can run the sensor over your pipes." I looked at the toolbox at his feet. It was large and heavy, but it didn't have the logo of the local gas provider. In fact, it looked like a reinforced tactical case, the kind people use to transport sensitive electronics or high-end firearms. I realized with a sickening clarity that he wasn't here to save my house from a leak. He was using the blackout as a golden opportunity to get inside while my security system was offline and my neighbors were all distracted by their own dark living rooms. "Just a second," I said, backing away from the door and moving toward the kitchen counter where I had left my phone. "I'm going to call the gas company's emergency line just to verify your ID number." The moment those words left my mouth, the polite, professional tone of the man outside evaporated. "Don't be difficult, Jennifer," he snapped, using my name with a coldness that made my blood run cold. "The phone lines are jammed because of the outage. Just open the door and let me do my job before things get complicated for both of us." The threat was thinly veiled, and the fact that he knew my name meant this wasn't a random choice. He had been waiting for the lights to go out. I realized that my cell phone had no bars. The cell tower must have been affected by the same surge that took out the grid. I was truly alone, and the only thing standing between me and whatever was in that heavy black case was a single wooden door. I heard a metallic clink as he reached into his vest, but it wasn't a gas sensor he pulled out. I watched through the peephole as he produced a long, heavy pry bar. He didn't even try to hide it anymore. He stepped back, bracing his shoulder against the door frame, and jammed the flat end of the tool into the gap between the door and the jamb. "I'm giving you one more chance to make this easy," he whispered, his face now pressed so close to the door that I could hear the rasp of his breathing. "If I have to break this door, I'm going to be very upset when I get inside." I didn't waste another second. I knew the door wouldn't hold against a pry bar for more than a minute. I ran to the back of the house, my mind racing through the floor plan. The basement. He wanted to go to the basement because that's where the heavy-duty safe was bolted to the floor, the one my late husband had installed for his coin collection. The inspector wasn't here for me. He was here for the safe, and he knew exactly where it was. I didn't go to the basement. Instead, I grabbed the heavy fire extinguisher from the hallway and headed for the attic stairs. I climbed the narrow wooden steps and pulled the folding ladder up behind me, locking the manual latches just as I heard the front door scream as the wood finally gave way. The sound of him entering the house was terrifying. He didn't run. He walked with a heavy, purposeful tread, his dress shoes clicking on the hardwood floors. I heard him throw the basement door open and stomp down the stairs, his muffled voice cursing when he realized I wasn't down there. He was looking for me now, not just the safe. He knew that as long as I was a witness, he wasn't safe. I sat in the pitch-black attic, the smell of old dust and insulation filling my lungs, clutching the fire extinguisher like a lifeline. I heard him come back up from the basement, his footsteps getting louder as he moved through the kitchen and the living room. Then, he stopped right beneath the attic hatch. "I know you're up there, Jennifer," he called out, his voice echoing in the small space. "Those folding ladders don't hide the fact that the latch is turned from the inside. You're just making this take longer than it needs to." I heard him grab a chair from the hallway and set it down beneath the hatch. He was going to try to force his way up. I knew I only had one shot. I moved to the very edge of the hatch, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would crack my ribs. I heard him fumbling with the lock, trying to jam the pry bar into the thin slit of the attic door. As the hatch began to creak open, I didn't wait for him to see me. I aimed the nozzle of the fire extinguisher through the widening gap and squeezed the trigger with everything I had. A massive, blinding cloud of white chemical powder exploded downward, filling the small hallway below and catching him directly in the face. I heard a choked scream and the sound of him falling off the chair, crashing hard against the floor. The powder would be stinging his eyes and lungs, making it impossible for him to breathe or see. I didn't hesitate. I kicked the hatch wide open and jumped down, landing on the carpeted floor just a few feet away from where he was thrashing and coughing on the floor, his face white with the chemical dust. I didn't look back. I ran out the broken front door and into the street, screaming at the top of my lungs. My neighbor 3 houses down, a retired police officer who had been sitting on his porch with a flashlight, heard me and came running with his service weapon drawn. By the time the police arrived, the inspector had managed to stumble out the back door and into the woods, but he had left his heavy black case behind. Inside, the police didn't find gas tools. They found a high-end thermal imaging camera, a set of heavy-duty bolt cutters, and a folder containing my daily schedule, my bank statements, and a floor plan of my house with the safe's location circled in red ink. The man was never caught, but the police believe he was part of a professional crew that followed high-end estate auctions to find their targets. I had the safe removed the next week, and I moved into a condo with a gated entrance and a security team that doesn't let anyone in without a verified appointment. I still hate the dark, and every time the power flickers during a storm, I find myself holding my breath, listening for the sound of dress shoes on a wooden porch. The heavy, rhythmic thud against my front door didn't sound like a visitor or a neighbor, but rather like the calculated, authoritative strike of someone who owned the hallway outside my apartment. It was 3:14 in the morning, a time when the world is usually wrapped in a suffocating layer of silence. Yet here I was, bolt upright in bed with my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I lived on the 4th floor of a converted industrial building where the walls were thick enough to dull most sounds. But that knock, heavy, metallic, and insistent, vibrated through the floorboards and into the very frame of my bed. I sat there for a moment, holding my breath, hoping that if I remained perfectly still, the intruder would decide the unit was empty and move on to another door. But then the voice came, muffled yet incredibly firm, vibrating through the wood with a tone of practiced command that made my blood run cold. "Police department, open up. We have a reported emergency in the building and need to conduct a structural sweep of this unit immediately." I didn't move at first because my mind was racing through 1,000 different possibilities, wondering why the police would be knocking on my door specifically when I hadn't heard any sirens or seen any flashing lights through my window. I climbed out of bed, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood, and crept toward the living room while keeping the lights off to avoid signaling that I was awake. The hallway was a dark tunnel, illuminated only by the faint blue glow of the microwave clock in the kitchen. And as I reached the door, I felt a draft of cold air whistling through the gap in the frame. I peered through the tiny glass lens of the peephole, and my breath hitched in my throat when I saw a man standing there, dressed in a dark tactical vest with the word police stenciled across the chest in faded white letters. He looked official, with a radio clipped to his shoulder that emitted a low, static-filled chatter, and a heavy utility belt that clinked every time he shifted his weight. "Sir, I know you're standing behind the door. I can hear your breathing, and I need you to cooperate so we can ensure the safety of the residents on this floor." His voice was calm, almost bored, which was the most terrifying part of the interaction because it suggested that this was just another Tuesday for him, while my entire world was tilting on its axis. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the cold metal of the deadbolt, but I didn't turn it because something felt fundamentally wrong about the way he was standing. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking down at the lock, and he was holding a small, silver tool in his left hand that didn't look like any piece of police equipment I had ever seen. Why was he alone? Why weren't there other officers visible in the hallway? And why hadn't the building manager sent out an emergency alert through the intercom system? "I'm going to need to see some identification through the peephole before I open this door. You caught me off guard, and I'm sure you understand that I have to be careful given the hour." I tried to keep my voice steady, but the tremor was undeniable, and as soon as the words left my mouth, the man stopped moving entirely. He didn't reach for a badge, and he didn't hold up a photo ID. Instead, he stepped closer, so close that his face blurred in the fisheye lens of the peephole, leaving only one dark, unblinking eye visible. He stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, the static from his radio providing a white noise soundtrack to my escalating panic. I wondered if he could hear my heart beating through the door, or if he was simply waiting for me to crack under the pressure of the silence. The building has a gas leak in the crawl space directly beneath your floorboards, and every second you spend arguing with me is a second we lose in preventing a catastrophic event. Do you want to be responsible for the lives of everyone in this complex? His tone had shifted from bored to aggressive, a sharp edge cutting through his words that made me instinctively take a step back. The gas leak excuse felt like a scripted line, a way to create a sense of urgency that would bypass my logic and force me to act on impulse. I looked toward the kitchen, my eyes searching for my phone, which I realized was still plugged into the charger on the far side of the room. If I ran for it, he would hear me, and if he really was who he said he was, I would be interfering with a police investigation. But if he wasn't, then I was currently trapped in a high-rise box with a predator at the only exit. "I'm calling the station to verify your badge number right now. Just stay right there and I'll have this sorted in a minute." I lied, hoping the threat of official scrutiny would make him retreat, but instead of walking away, I heard a sickeningly familiar sound, the metallic scrape of a key sliding into the lock. My stomach dropped into a cold abyss as I realized that he wasn't just some random stranger. He had a key to my home, a key that worked, because I could hear the internal tumblers clicking over one by one. I lunged forward, throwing my entire body weight against the door just as the deadbolt retracted, feeling the massive force of him pushing from the other side. We were locked in a silent, desperate struggle, the only sound being the grunts of exertion and the wood of the door frame groaning under the immense pressure. "Open the door, Leo. I know you're in there, and I know you haven't changed the locks since I moved out 3 years ago." The use of my name hit me like a physical blow, stripping away the mask of the anonymous police officer and revealing the true horror of the situation. This wasn't a random crime. It was a ghost from my past, a former tenant who had lived here long before me, someone who had kept a copy of the key and had been watching me from the shadows of the city. The realization sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system, and I managed to shove the door shut just enough to flip the manual security latch, the small metal swing arm that was the only thing standing between me and him. He began to laugh then, a dry, wheezing sound that was far more terrifying than his shouts had been, and he started to throw his shoulder against the door with rhythmic, bone-jarring impacts. I scrambled back into the kitchen, grabbing a heavy cast iron skillet from the stove and my phone from the counter, my fingers fumbling as I dialed the emergency digits. The operator's voice was a lifeline, a calm presence in the middle of the storm, and I screamed my address into the receiver while the man outside started to use a crowbar to pry the door away from the frame. "He's in the hallway. He's wearing a fake police vest and he has a key. Please, he's going to get through the latch." I watched in horror as the wood began to splinter, the metal arm of the security latch bending under the relentless force of his leverage. I realized then that I couldn't just wait for the police to arrive. I had to create a barrier, something that would buy me the precious minutes I needed to survive. I grabbed the heavy wooden dining table and began to drag it across the floor, the legs screeching against the wood, a sound that masked the splintering of my front door. I shoved it against the entryway, followed by 2 heavy chairs, creating a chaotic barricade of furniture just as the security latch finally snapped and flew across the room like a piece of shrapnel. The door swung open a few inches, stopped by the weight of the table, and I saw a hand reach through the gap, a hand wearing a black glove, clutching a heavy flashlight that he began to swing wildly, trying to strike anything within reach. I stood behind the table, clutching my phone and the skillet, my eyes fixed on that hand as I heard the distant, beautiful sound of sirens wailing in the streets below. The man heard them too, because the frantic shoving stopped instantly, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps retreating down the hallway toward the fire escape. I didn't move for a long time, not even when the Real police arrived and began shouting through the door, identifying themselves with badge numbers that I actually verified through the operator still on the line. When I finally pulled back the furniture and opened what was left of my door, the hallway was empty, the fake officer gone into the night. They found the tactical vest and the radio in the alleyway behind the building, but the man himself had vanished into the urban labyrinth. I moved out the very next day, but even now, in my new home with 3 different high-security locks, I still find myself waking up at 3:14 in the morning. I sit in the dark and I listen, waiting for that heavy, authoritative knock that I know, deep down, might one day return to finish what it started.